The first thing I heard before the attack was the sound of my own coffee hitting the floor. I was carrying 2 cups down Corridor 7 of the UES Defiance, one for me and one for Private Owen Dale, who was posted at the forward security checkpoint and had been awake for 19 straight hours. The cups were cheap printed plastic, and the coffee inside was the kind that tastes like someone described real coffee to a machine that had never tasted anything. Bitter and thin and made your teeth feel odd. But it was hot, and Owen needed it. And I was the kind of sergeant who believed that keeping your people functional was more important than maintaining any personal image of authority. I never reached him. The ship lurched so hard that both cups left my hands before my mind had time to process what was happening. I hit the left wall with my shoulder, bounced off, grabbed the ceiling rail with both hands, and hung there, while the Defiance screamed around me. Not a metaphor. The ship actually screamed, a long, low, tearing groan that started deep in the hull and traveled upward through every wall and floor and ceiling simultaneously, the sound of metal being pushed against forces it was never designed to absorb. Every light in the corridor shifted from white to red in the same half-second, emergency protocol triggering automatically across the entire ship at once. The floor under my feet vibrated in a way that was different from engine vibration, more urgent and irregular, the rhythm of something responding to damage rather than generating power. The speaker system activated. Captain Louise Hargrove's voice came through the ship-wide channel flat and precise, the voice she used when things were very wrong, and she needed people to receive the information clearly enough to act on it immediately. All hands. Multiple contacts dropping from FTL at grid reference 779er. 30+ signatures. Keth Sol configuration. This is not a drill. Repeat, not a drill. All combat personnel to battle stations immediately. All non-combat personnel to emergency positions. Security detail. Proceed to the diplomatic section now. 30 ships. We had one. I was already running before she finished the last word. My name is Marcus Hale. I was 31 years old when the Keth Sol ambush happened. A sergeant in the 32nd Human Expeditionary Marine Corps, assigned to shipboard security on what everyone in the mission briefing had called a milk run. Protect the diplomatic delegates during transit. Stand in corridors. Look reliable. Humanity had spent the better part of a decade trying to earn a recognized place in the galactic community, and the Vethari Imperium had finally agreed to let us prove we could keep one of their people safe during a short transit to a peace summit, a gesture of good faith, an audition for a seat at a table we very much wanted to sit at. Simple. That was the exact word in the mission briefing. Simple transit escort. Low risk. An opportunity to demonstrate we could be trusted. 9 years in the Marines had taught me that when officers call something simple and low risk, you should find a solid wall and put your back against it. The Defiance was not a warship in any meaningful combat sense. She was a diplomatic escort vessel, fast and well shielded for her class, capable of handling the kind of minor threats that appeared in disputed transit lanes. She was not designed to absorb sustained fire from 30 Keth Sol destroyers. Nobody had designed her for that because nobody had thought anyone would be aggressive enough to try it against a diplomatic ship on a humanitarian mission. The Keth Sol were one of the oldest spacefaring civilizations in this arm of the galaxy. Gray-skinned, three-jointed, with eyes built for wavelengths humans could not perceive, they had been pressing outward against the borders of every neighboring civilization for 2 centuries, methodical and patient, with the deep confidence of something that had never been effectively pushed back. The peace summit threatened all of that. The Vethari Imperium's agreement to attend, to support a framework that would formally limit territorial claims across the contested regions, was a direct challenge to everything the Keth Sol had been building. Their response was to eliminate the challenge before it could be formalized. The delegate traveling to the summit was Princess Velasha of the Vethari Imperium. She was somewhere on this burning ship, and it was my job to find her and keep her alive, and the Defiance was shuddering around me with the particular violence of a vessel, receiving damage she was not built to absorb. I reached the diplomatic section in just under 2 minutes, moving through corridors that tilted and shook and filled with the chemical smell of systems working past their safe thresholds. I passed 2 Marines heading the same direction, and fell in behind them without breaking stride. Lieutenant Connor Price was already at the entrance to the Vethari quarters, leading a 6-person detail, standing with the controlled steadiness of an officer absorbing a rapidly evolving situation and managing it in real time. "Hale," he identified me without turning his head. Connor Price had always been able to map a room without looking at it directly. Princess is inside with her personal guard. 3 attendants confirmed with her. We are moving them to Pod Bay 4 immediately. Transit shaft is our fastest route. Tactical read? I asked. He paused for half a second. Connor Price did not pause. When Connor Price paused, it meant the information was severe enough that he was selecting what to give me. Not favorable, he said. I translated that without difficulty. We were losing the fight happening outside this hull. Captain still has the weapons? Captain is buying time, he said. Move. The door to the Vethari quarters opened. I had seen Princess Velasha twice before this moment. The first time when she boarded the Defiance at the orbital facility above Earth's moon, surrounded by her full diplomatic staff and personal guard, moving through the docking corridor with the practiced ease of someone raised in public prominence. She had not looked at me then. I was part of the ship's architecture as far as she was concerned. Furniture and a uniform. The second time was 3 days into the transit, through the viewport of the observation lounge. She was standing alone at the glass, watching the stars move past, her bioluminescent patterns lit in a slow, thoughtful blue. She did not know I could see her. She was simply standing there, somewhere inside her own thoughts. Both times she had looked through me. She looked through me again now, scanning the corridor and its occupants with the rapid, systematic assessment of someone trained in crisis management. She was tall, the way all Vethari were tall, nearly 2 meters, with silver-gray skin that caught the red emergency lighting and gave it back as something cooler. 4 fingers on each hand, proportionally longer than human fingers. Dark eyes without visible whites, built for a broader spectrum than mine. And the bioluminescent patterns that traced from her collarbones up the sides of her neck and behind her ears were moving rapidly through colors, blue to gold, to a deep unsettled violet. The Vethari equivalent of a racing heartbeat. She was afraid. She was simply extremely accomplished at not allowing that fear to reach her face, or her voice. Commander Vey, her personal guard commander, moved in front of her the instant the door opened. He was nearly a full head above me in height, built like someone had assembled a soldier from the largest available components, wearing armor that made my marine kit look like a practice set. His bioluminescent patterns were flat and controlled, held deliberately steady in the muted colors of combat readiness. "We require evacuation to Pod Bay 4, he said, his translator giving the words an authoritative flatness. Immediately. That is the current plan, Price said. He did not debate it. Stay close to the forward line, move when we move, and stop when we stop. My guard will flank. Your guard will follow, Price said. Clear and final. This was his operational space, and he was managing it. We move now. We moved. The formation, 6 Marines ahead, 2 Vethari guard flanking the Princess, me directly behind her, 3 attendants behind me, Owen Dale and Private Clara Webb covering the rear. The formation you drill until the body finds its place without the mind needing to direct it. The Defiance was dying around us in stages, not all at once but progressively, each system reaching its limit at its own individual pace. The main weapons array went quiet for 32 seconds and came back at partial power. The engine room reported a secondary coolant failure and then went silent on that channel. The captain's voice on the command frequency was measured and clipped and gave nothing away except the steady narrowing of what was still available. Corridor 9 was where everything changed. We were moving through a section of the ship close to the outer hull, darker than the central corridors, lit only by emergency strips along the floor. The air had changed here, thinner, carrying a dry chemical smell that meant hull integrity nearby was under stress. I could feel the difference in how the vibration traveled through the floor, less insulated, more direct, the ship's stress speaking through the soles of my boots. 70 meters from the entrance to Corridor 11 and the route to Pod Bay 4, the boarding torpedo hit. I did not see it. I heard it. A sound like the largest possible impact condensed into one single moment. The end of the corridor ahead of us became light, not panel light or emergency light, but the rolling orange-white of superheated expanding gas, the plasma discharge of a torpedo breach system filling an enclosed space, the way water fills a pipe, fast and complete and indifferent. Price shouted. Clara was already moving, pulling Owen sideways into a maintenance alcove cut into the wall. The attendants scattered. Commander Vey braced. The Princess stopped. not from fear. The Vethari Crisis Response Protocol instructs a Vethari in danger to stop all movement, assess all available options with complete information, and then act with precision. It is an excellent protocol, refined over centuries, deeply effective in situations that provide adequate time. She had approximately 1.5 seconds. I was behind her and slightly left. My hands were already on her shoulders, already moving her toward the wall, already bringing my back around to face the corridor. All of this happening in the same moment, body and decision operating together, below the speed of conscious thought. She made a sound against my chest, short and controlled and involuntary, the Vethari equivalent of a gasp. Her bioluminescent patterns went through every color at once, a full spectrum burst, every shade firing simultaneously, like a scream rendered in light. I had time for exactly one thought. It was a small thought. I thought that I had been meaning to tell Owen Dale that he was one of the finest soldiers I had ever worked alongside, and I had kept putting it off, and I was going to regret that. Then the plasma wave hit, and I stopped thinking anything at all. What happened next happened without me. The physicians who reconstructed the event from scene data and biological evidence determined the following. The wave spent the majority of its thermal energy on me. My armor absorbed a portion. The rest was absorbed by my back, my shoulders, and the back of my skull, in a distribution that was catastrophic by any medical standard they applied. The princess sustained minor burns to her hands and left forearm from secondary radiant heat around my left side, where the coverage was slightly less complete. She was otherwise uninjured. I was not otherwise uninjured. I was not, by any assessment the Vethari physicians had available to them, compatible with survival. And yet, Connor Price found them 11 seconds after the wave cleared the corridor, moving back through smoke from the maintenance alcove. The princess was on the floor with her arms under my shoulders, trying to lift me. She had no identified destination. She had not called for assistance. She had assessed that I was on the floor, and this was not acceptable. And so she was solving that specific problem with the resources she had, which were her own hands, and a determination that appeared, from the outside, to be complete and without reservation. She was talking while she worked. Vethari, too fast for Price to follow with his basic translation pack. He moved to help her. She did not stop. Owen and Clara helped Price. A maintenance sled, 3 corridors over. They loaded me onto it. She walked beside the sled from that point to Pod Bay 2, because Pod Bay 4 was already gone, hit by a separate torpedo 7 minutes before ours. The full length of the route, through smoke and red-lit corridors with the ship dying around them in its ongoing stages, she kept one hand on the rim of the sled, 4 silver-gray fingers curled around the edge of it. She did not release it until they reached the pod, and there was no more corridor left to walk. The escape pod launched with 12 people inside. 11 of them were conscious. Above them, the Defiance kept fighting. She fought for 47 minutes. Her weapons went quiet in sequence, as each array failed. Her shields compressed gradually inward. Her engines lasted longest, giving the ship maneuverability that she used with everything the crew still had. She was not destroyed in the fight. She was crippled, and then boarded, and then left. Which says something about what the Kethsol thought of her by the end. What they thought, the analysis later determined, was that she had cost them more than she should have. 1 escort vessel against 30 destroyers had not been the quick victory they had planned. It had been a sustained engagement that gave the escape pods time to reach safe distance, and gave the other summit delegates, traveling on separate ships, time to receive the distress signal and alter their courses. The Defiance could not win that fight. She fought it anyway. That difference mattered. In the rescue ship's medical bay, 3 hours after the pod was recovered, the senior Vethari physician finished his initial assessment and turned to the doorway where the princess was standing. He spoke to her directly. "Your Highness," he said, "the injuries are not consistent with survival." She looked at him. Her bioluminescent patterns were very still. "Begin treatment," she said. He hesitated, the careful hesitation of a physician who believes in honest communication. "Your Highness, the resource requirements would be considerable, and the probability of a favorable—" "Begin treatment," she said. Same words, same tone. No elevation in volume. No threat implicit or explicit. Simply the absolute clarity of a person who is not asking a question, and is fully aware that everyone present understands this. Treatment began. What followed was a medical effort that the Vethari Imperium had never applied to a human being before. Their technology was superior to Earth's in this area, significantly so. Cellular reconstruction, plasma damage reversal, neural stabilization protocols that were calibrated for Vethari physiology and adjusted in real time for a body the system had no baseline for. It was expensive and uncertain, and it should not have worked. It worked. Not quickly, not cleanly. But the ember did not go out. By the time the rescue vessel reached the nearest Vethari medical station, I was alive in the technical sense of the word, the way a fire is alive when it has been reduced to one small persistent coal, not burning, not gone. They put me into medical stasis, partly because the injuries required long-term repair that active treatment could not accelerate, partly because no one was entirely certain what my biology was doing and they wanted time to understand it. Mostly, I think, because the ember was so small and they were afraid that any disturbance might put it out. The stasis pod sealed around me. In the corridor outside the stasis room, a notification panel displayed my name and status. Brief, clinical, accurate. It said nothing about the corridor on the Defiance, or the plasma wave, or the woman who had tried to lift me with her own hands and had not let go of the sled. It simply said what it knew: stable, critical, indefinite. She stood in front of that panel for a long time before her attendants finally, carefully, led her away. I was in the dark for 6 years, 4 months, and 11 days. I did not experience this as time. There was no sense of duration in the stasis, no dreams in any shape I would have recognized, no awareness of hours turning to days, or days turning to seasons, on the world I could not see. There were only fragments, rising and falling without pattern or logic, the way very early memories surface sometimes from the edge of sleep, brief and disconnected and gone, before they could be examined. I heard voices sometimes, in those fragments. The language was Vethari, and my translator implant was not operating at the depth of the stasis, so the words arrived incomplete, broken into sounds without full meaning. But certain patterns repeated, the rhythm of clinical language, dense and formal, the particular weight of a word being chosen carefully. I recognized these rhythms without being able to hear through them to the content. I heard her voice once, in a fragment that felt longer and closer than the others. She was reading something aloud, going through a report section by section, speaking the parts that required more careful consideration. Her voice had a quality in that fragment that I could not identify in the moment, and only understood later. It was the voice of someone carrying a significant weight, and doing it without any outward sign of the effort. I heard other things, the ambient sounds of a station running its routines. Machinery in the middle distance. Once, very clearly, the sound of laughter from somewhere down a corridor, the kind of laughter that carries, because the person does not know they can be heard. I slept through all of it. The galaxy did not. The HFY War went from cold to hot in the weeks following the ambush on the Defiance. The attack had miscalculated something fundamental about what it would produce. The HFY leadership had believed that destroying the diplomatic convoy would delay the peace summit indefinitely. They expected the Vethari Imperium to withdraw into grief and reorganization. They expected humanity to be frightened back. They expected the assembled coalition to collapse under the shock of open violence against a diplomatic mission. Instead, the attack became the reason the coalition held. The summit delegates who received the Defiance's distress signal and altered their routes did not go home. They regrouped at a secondary location, 3 weeks late, 1 delegate missing, and they signed the framework agreement that the attack had been designed to prevent, not defiantly, not as a statement. They signed it because the work of building it had already been done, and there was no logical reason to let violence erase that work. The HFY had tried to stop the summit by force, and the response from the people they had tried to stop was to hold the summit anyway. Then, the Vethari Imperium's military response began. Humanity contributed, at first modestly, a few ships, a few marine units, the gesture of a species still learning the weight of galactic commitments and calculating carefully what it could sustain. Then the story of the Defiance spread. Not because anyone organized its distribution, it spread because it was the kind of story that moves on its own. the kind that gets into conversations because it is difficult to stop thinking about once you have encountered it. 1 escort vessel against 30 destroyers. 47 minutes of sustained fight against impossible odds, buying time for the people inside to reach safety. A human crew that had looked at the arithmetic and decided the arithmetic was not the relevant factor. In 3 separate alien languages, new words were coined during this period. The translations varied, but converged on a common meaning, something like the ones who do not stop, or the ones who fight past the point of sense. The Kethsol language produced the most specific version, a phrase that Bright Edge later translated for me literally as the ones who bite after the teeth are gone. Humanity's military contribution grew. The species that had arrived late to the galactic community, and that most of the established powers had regarded as an interesting but essentially peripheral development, turned out to be something different when the situation required it. The Kethsol War ended in the 3rd year of my stasis. Not dramatically, not in a single decisive battle that changed everything. It ended the way most prolonged conflicts end, gradually, with exhaustion playing as significant a role as strategy. Their supply lines stretched to the limits of what their logistics could sustain. Political support at home eroded under the accumulated cost. The neighboring species they had been pressing against for decades, emboldened by the coalition actually holding and fighting back, began pressing in return. The Kethsol leadership that had ordered the ambush was replaced by a political faction that had been arguing against the escalation since before it started, and was now, very expensively, proven correct. The peace treaty was signed 18 months later, at a summit that bore deliberate structural resemblance to the one that had been attacked. Same framework, same parties, same founding principles. The message was not stated explicitly. It did not need to be. Humanity's council seat was formalized as part of the treaty structure, not a symbolic seat, not an observer status, but a recognized full voting seat, with the weight that comes from having contributed meaningfully to a conflict that other, older species had not been certain a newly arrived civilization was capable of contributing to at all. The Emperor of the Vethari Imperium died in the 4th year of my stasis, an illness his physicians had been managing quietly for longer than the public knew. The transition was handled with the practiced care of an imperial system that had conducted successions before. The grief was real. The ceremony was precise. The crown passed to his eldest daughter in a proceeding that the Vethari court described afterward as exemplary in its dignity. She accepted it with the complete seriousness she brought to everything. In the medical station, in the room where my pod sat inside its monitoring systems, the machines ran their routines, and the ember kept burning. Not growing, not receding, simply persisting, in the way that certain things persist when they have decided not to stop. She did not stop coming. The station logs show this clearly. Regular visits, sometimes following the natural patterns of her schedule, when that schedule brought her near the station, and sometimes not following any pattern except the one she had decided on. The attending physicians adjusted their protocols around her visits. The station's administration created standing procedures for her arrivals. She was, by any measure, an unusual visitor for an unusual patient. She also began, during this period, to learn English. She did not announce it publicly. She did not frame it as an official diplomatic initiative. She requested teaching materials through her personal aide, arranged the lessons around her existing obligations, and pursued the language with the focused systematic determination that she applied to everything she decided mattered. Her first teacher was a digital educational system, standard and patient, and designed for the kind of learner who would work through it methodically. She worked through it faster than the system anticipated. She corrected her own pronunciation errors before the system could flag them. She memorized vocabulary in amounts that exceeded what the system delivered efficiently, and so she added supplementary sources. Her second teacher was Professor Alan Marsh, a human linguist who had been on a research appointment at a Vethari academic institution for 3 years, when he received a message from the Royal Office requesting his availability for a consulting engagement on human linguistic structures. He arrived expecting to advise on academic work. He found himself teaching the Queen personally, and was by his own account so completely destabilized by this situation that he taught the best lesson of his professional career out of sheer reflexive competence. She learned the way she learned everything, without shortcuts, without accepting that any element of the language was beyond what she could master. Within 14 months, she had functional fluency. Within 2 years, she had the English of someone who had been reading extensively in the language and thinking in it, not merely speaking borrowed phrases. Within 4 years, she sounded like someone who had grown up hearing it, not because she had imitated any particular regional accent, but because she had understood the language deeply enough to build her version from its fundamental structures, rather than from surface imitation. She learned it for someone who could not hear her yet. Nobody asked her directly why she had chosen this. It would have been inappropriate to ask. The Queen's private pursuits were her own, but the people around her were not without the capacity to draw conclusions. Her personal aide, who had known her since childhood and understood the long arcs of her intentions, said later that the language was never separate from the question she was holding, the question of whether the stasis pod would open, the question of what she would say if it did. She was preparing in the only direction available to her, against an outcome she had declined to accept as impossible. Outside the station, the galaxy continued its complicated work. New alliances formed, technologies developed, borders shifted in the careful, measured ways that borders shift when the parties involved have recently paid the full cost of shifting them by force. The Kethsol, under new leadership, began a slow, difficult process of reintegration into the galactic framework they had spent decades undermining. It was uncomfortable and genuinely uncertain, and the scholars who studied it said it was one of the more unexpected diplomatic developments of the century. Humanity established its council presence and began the long, practical work of figuring out how to use it effectively, which was harder than the briefing documents had suggested, and more interesting than anyone had publicly admitted hoping for. Human ships moved through galactic transit lanes that would have been closed to them 5 years earlier. Human marine units trained alongside Vethari defense forces in exercises that would have been unthinkable when the Defiance was first commissioned. Human diplomats sat at tables and spoke into record, and voted on things that affected hundreds of star systems and billions of lives, and tried to do it with the care that required. The Relon academic community published a landmark study during this period. Commissioned by the Queen of the Vethari Imperium, it was a comprehensive examination of human history, conducted by 17 scholars across 4 academic disciplines. The commission brief asked them to identify, from external observation, the defining characteristic of humanity as a species. It took 3 years, and produced a document that was, by galactic academic standards, lengthy and thorough, and intensely debated in the months after its release. Their conclusion was that no single defining characteristic could be isolated from the others. Human history showed intelligence, creativity, capacity for both extraordinary cooperation and devastating conflict, artistic expression across an enormous range of forms, scientific innovation, and a comprehensive list of qualities that other spacefaring civilizations demonstrated in various proportions. But one quality appeared with unusual consistency across human history. It appeared in individuals, and in communities, and in civilizations as a whole. It appeared in conditions of material advantage, and in conditions of catastrophe. It appeared when the outcome was positive, and when it was not. The scholars had named it, in their formal language, persistent volitional engagement, despite adverse prediction, which is an elegant way of saying that humans keep trying when the math says stop. The Queen read the summary on the morning it was submitted, between 2 council sessions and a state communication that needed drafting. She read it completely. Then she sat with it for a while before setting it down. She did not mention it at the council session. Some things are not for councils. In the 5th year of my stasis, the monitoring systems at the medical station recorded a shift. Subtle, gradual, the kind that the automated system flagged as a threshold event and routed to the attending physician for review. The physician reviewed it, updated the monitoring parameters, and sent a brief communication to the Queen's office. It said, "Preliminary indicators suggest possible recovery progression. Timeline not determinable. Continued observation recommended." She wrote back a single line, "Continue all current protocols and notify me immediately of any further change." In the 6th year, the shifts became consistent. Neural activity climbing by measurable degrees. Cellular repair metrics reaching thresholds that had been set at the beginning as theoretical targets. Numbers placed there to define what sufficient recovery would look like, without any confidence at the time that they would be reached. They were being reached. The stasis pod systems noted the trajectory, and began preparing for the possibility of natural transition, not forcing it, not accelerating it, simply watching and adjusting and following what the biology inside was choosing to do. The biology was choosing to return. On the morning that every required threshold was crossed simultaneously, the pod sent 3 alerts: to the attending physician, to the station administrator, and to a private channel that had been registered at the Queen's specific request, years earlier, linked to a device she kept with her at all times. The alert was brief. It said, "Subject entering natural consciousness. Estimated full awareness within 6 to 12 hours." She was in a council session when the device notified her. 7 council members discussing a trade agreement that had been under extended review. She looked at the device. The session continued around her. Voices measured and patient in the way of people who have been doing this work long enough to be patient about it. She turned the device face down on the table. The council members waited. She looked up. Her bioluminescent patterns shifted through something brief, something that none of them had seen before settling back to the silver calm of the Queen in session. "We will continue this session tomorrow," she said. "Something requires my attention today." The council did not ask what. It was not the council's place. She was aboard a personal transport within 2 hours, moving through space at a speed that the transport systems considered optimal and that she considered insufficient. The transit took 4 hours. She spent most of it in the rear section of the transport with her personal aide, working through the communications queue that had accumulated during the council session she had left unfinished. She was not someone who could stop working simply because the circumstances were unusual. She had tried that approach once. She had told me much later, early in her position as her father's heir, when the pressure of the role had become temporarily too much, and she had attempted to simply stop for a day. She had managed 7 hours before the pile of things that needed her attention had become more stressful than doing them. She had not attempted it since. Her personal aide, a quiet and extremely efficient Vethari woman named Ray, who had been in her service for 11 years, had arranged the communication queue in order of urgency and had pre-drafted responses to the items that did not require the Queen's specific judgment, needing only her review and approval. This was, Ray told me later, standard practice. It had been standard practice since the early days of the Queen's service as heir, when her father had observed how she handled administrative overload and had assigned Ray specifically, because Ray could provide the kind of organized support that let a person with an enormous amount to do actually get all of it done without drowning. The Queen reviewed each item with complete attention. She gave each one the consideration it deserved, and not more, which is a skill that sounds simple, and is in practice very difficult, and is perhaps the most practically valuable skill that anyone managing significant responsibility can develop. She approved the pre-drafted responses and amended 3 of them. She wrote 4 items from scratch. She read a detailed briefing on the RIM threat's latest sensor data, which Sev had sent directly to her channel, with a note that the situation was stable but developing, and which she read twice before she set it aside. At some point during the 4 hours, she put the communication queue down and sat looking at nothing in particular for approximately 20 minutes. Ray, who had been in her service long enough to recognize this, did not interrupt. This was, Ray also told me later, the thing that people who observed the Queen from the outside rarely understood. The appearance of complete calm and steady forward motion was not the absence of what lay beneath it. It was the result of the discipline she applied to giving the things beneath it the time they needed, in the space she created for them, so that they did not spill into the spaces where the work needed to happen. The 20 minutes, the viewport, the stars that did not require anything of you. After 20 minutes, she picked the communication queue back up. The station appeared in the transport's viewport an hour later. She watched it grow from a point of light to a structure with visible detail, a small station against the larger dark, doing its modest and practical work of keeping certain kinds of effort moving through the galaxy. She looked at it the way she looked at things she had been thinking about for a long time, with the complete attention that comes from having prepared for this moment so thoroughly that there is nothing left to prepare. The transport docked. She walked through the station's corridors without ceremony, with Ray and 2 members of her personal guard who stayed at a respectful distance. She knew where the stasis room was. She had been there many times. She stopped outside the door for a moment. Then she went in. I woke up to a ceiling that looked like frozen starlight. That was my first clear impression. Not a complete thought, but a simple registration of available information. Something pale and crystalline above me, structured in a pattern my memory had no match for. Not medical equipment, not a ship's ceiling. Something that had been built with attention to how things looked as well as how they functioned. My second impression was the smell of the air, recycled, like all closed-system environments, but with something underneath it, faint and botanical. Nothing like the metal and chemical smell of the Defiance. Something considered. My third impression was that my back did not hurt. This was wrong. My back should have hurt considerably. My back should, by any assessment I was capable of making at that moment, not have been present at all. I moved my right hand. It moved. I moved my left hand. It moved. I took the careful, systematic inventory that years of waking up in uncertain situations had made automatic, checking the presence and function of each part of myself before committing to any assumptions about the whole. Fingers, hands, arms responding to signals I was sending, the weight of my chest moving with my breathing, the feeling of a surface below my feet. Everything present, everything responding. I turned my head to the right. A young Vethari physician was sitting in a chair, approximately 1 meter from the side of the bed, female, by the line of her jaw and the tones of her bioluminescent patterns. She had clearly been in the chair for some time before I turned my head, and she had clearly not been given fully adequate preparation for the moment when I did, because her expression was the specific expression of a professional who has been given an important responsibility and is now experiencing the anxiety of not being certain she is equipped for everything it might require. I opened my mouth. What came out was not English. Slow and imperfect and missing a large portion of the vocabulary I would have needed to say anything complex, but recognizably, Vethari. My translator implant, updated during my stasis as part of the facility's standard maintenance protocols, had received a comprehensive Vethari language package that it was now attempting to deploy on my behalf. The package was sophisticated enough that my implant was trying to speak for me before I had consciously decided what to say. The physician flinched very slightly. Then she stood up with the controlled purpose of someone who is very relieved to have a next action available, crossed to a communication panel on the wall, and pressed the contact point. She spoke rapidly. My updated implant rendered it as, "He is awake and speaking Vethari. Please send the senior physician. Also, please send whoever decided I should be here alone when this happened, because I would like to understand that decision-making process." I decided immediately that I liked her. The senior physician arrived within 10 minutes. Older, experienced, with the measured steadiness of someone who has delivered difficult information many times and understands that the delivery is as important as the content. He sat down in a second chair the young physician brought, and he began to speak in clear, simple Vethari that my implant rendered without difficulty. He told me the date first. Then he waited. 6 years, 4 months, 11 days. He let it sit. He did not rush to the next piece of information, and I was grateful for that, because the number needed time. Not processing time exactly. The calculation was simple enough. It needed the kind of time that very large things need when you give them room to settle properly, rather than pushing them into a space too small. I looked at the ceiling that looked like frozen starlight, and let the number settle. He told me about the crew of the Defiance. The ship was gone, decommissioned after recovery, the damage too extensive for economical repair. Most of the crew had survived, some had not. I did not ask for specific names yet. I needed the shape of things before I could carry the specific weights. He told me the war had ended. He told me about the peace treaty. He told me that humanity held a formal council seat, recognized and active, with real weight and a real vote, and that this had come partly through military contribution and partly through something that diplomatic circles had taken to calling the defiance principle, which he used as a phrase without apparent irony. He told me about the emperor. After that I was quiet for a longer time. Then I asked the question I had been building toward since the moment I opened my eyes. I had been constructing the foundation first, making sure everything else was solid ground, because I needed to know the answer was going to be one I could hold properly. I asked about the princess. He looked at me with an expression that I was now reading clearly enough in Vethari facial language to understand. It was the expression of someone delivering information that carries more than its words. "Her Majesty," he said, "is on her way." He used the title automatically, without emphasis or announcement. The way you use a title for someone whose identity has changed so completely that the previous one would sound like a mistake. I lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling and waited. She came in without announcement. No attendants ahead of her, no ceremony preceding her entry. She walked through the door of the medical room alone, carrying only herself. She was wearing something that was, I would learn later, simple by her standards. Deep blue, no ornamentation, except the silver bioluminescent patterns that traced their familiar paths from her collarbones upward. Those patterns were still and steady, the deep quiet color of winter water. She stood inside the doorway and looked at me. I had forgotten how completely she could inhabit a silence. I tried to sit up. My arms did the work, but slowly, and I ended up between sitting and propped, not what I had intended, but close enough to be functional. She watched this without stepping forward to help, without changing her position, and I understood without being told that she was reading the information available to her before she acted, collecting it carefully, the way she did everything. Then she crossed the room to the side of the bed, and she looked at me with her steady dark eyes, and she said in English that was clear and precise, and completely without any accent I could identify, "You took longer than I expected." My translator implant was silent. That was her. Her voice, her pronunciation, her grammar. English spoken with the ease of someone who has lived inside the language long enough to stop being conscious of its mechanics. I looked at her for a moment. "You learned English," I said. "Yes," she said. "When?" She considered the question with the brief, serious attention she gave all things worth considering. "I began approximately 3 months after your admission to this facility. The foundational components took 14 months. The remainder was an ongoing process." I did the math. She had been learning English for nearly 6 years. She had begun before anyone had any clarity about whether I would ever wake up to hear it. "You did not know if I was going to wake up," I said. "No," she said, "I did not. But you learned it anyway." Her bioluminescent patterns moved through one slow, quiet pulse of blue, just one, before settling back to silver. "You put your body between me and something unsurvivable," she said. "The least I could offer in return was the effort of learning your language, whether or not you were ever in a position to hear it." I did not have an adequate answer for that, so I said what was true and immediate, and the only thing available. "I am sorry about your father," I said. Her patterns went still, then moved slowly through something deep. "Thank you," she said. "He would have found you interesting. He valued things that did not behave according to expected prediction." We were quiet for a moment. The good kind of quiet, the kind two people share when they have both been through something significant and are taking a breath before the next part of the conversation begins. I looked at my hands. Changed in texture, the skin tighter across the backs of them. Different in the way that 6 years of cellular reconstruction leaves its mark. I was all there. But different. A repaired version of a previous self. "There is something at the rim," I said. She sat down in the chair the young physician had vacated, with the careful ease of someone who has learned to take rest when it is available, because rest is not always available. "Yes," she said. "Old?" "Very old," she said. "Dormant during the Kethsol conflict. It has been active for approximately 8 months. What do you need from me?" She looked at me steadily. Her patterns moved through something thoughtful. "The species that must cooperate to address this situation have reasons, many of them legitimate, not to trust each other. Some of those reasons are centuries old, and some are recent. What is needed is something that belongs to none of the existing frameworks, something new enough that the old structures cannot place it in their systems and dismiss it accordingly. Something that the major powers will receive as a genuine voice, rather than another position in an old argument." She paused. "Humanity. Specifically, you." I considered this honestly. I was an exhausted Marine sergeant who had been medically unconscious for 6 years. I did not know current alliance structures. I did not know treaty terms or council procedures or which relationships between species were functional and which were performed diplomacy. I had been introduced to the galactic community by absorbing plasma fire with my back, which was a notable introduction, but not a conventional diplomatic credential. I would need to learn a great deal before I could be useful, I said. I know, she said. I will teach you what I can. There are others who will teach you what I cannot. You will have time before you are actually needed. And if I want to go home? I asked. She did not flinch. She had clearly given this possibility real consideration. Then we will arrange your return to Earth. Full honor. Recognition appropriate to what you did. You would lack for nothing for the rest of your life. She paused. But I think you asked the question to understand the edges of the choice, rather than because you want the answer to be that you should leave. I thought about Connor Price, who had not made it out of the Defiance. I thought about a ship fighting 47 minutes against 30 for the people inside her. I thought about Owen Dale running on no sleep through burning corridors, because the situation asked it of him. I thought about a queen who had spent 6 years learning a language for a man she could not know would ever hear it. Tell me about the rim, I said. She told me. 2 hours. She sat in that chair and spoke clearly and without pause, covering the intelligence picture, the timeline of the threat's reactivation, the species that would need to participate in any coordinated response, and the specific political obstacles between them and that cooperation. She did not simplify. She did not assume I could not follow complexity I was encountering for the first time. She gave me the full information with the confidence of someone who respects the person they are informing. I listened. I asked questions. She answered them without impatience and without condescension. When she was done, I was quiet for a while. 8 days, she said. A council session. If you are physically ready. I will be ready, I said. I looked at the window. The light outside was the pale gold of a morning just beginning. The window faces east, I said. She said nothing. You had the room rotated, I said. 2 years ago, the physician told me. His notes indicated that morning light exposure supports human recovery, she said. It seemed practical to provide it. 2 years ago, I said. You did not know I was going to wake up. No, she said. I did not. We looked at each other across the small distance of the room. Thank you, I said. She nodded once, precisely the way she did everything. You are welcome, Sergeant Hale. Marcus, I said. You speak English. You can use Marcus. She considered this with the brief serious weight she brought to all things worth considering. Marcus, she said. She measured the sound of it. Yes. That is appropriate. I drank 3 cups of terrible coffee that the young physician brought, looking both proud of her efficiency and mildly concerned about my rate of consumption. The Queen watched this with the expression of a scientist encountering an interesting data point and filing it carefully. Outside the window that faced east, the sun was fully up now, the same sun that had risen every morning for 6 years while I was not there to see it, patient and consistent and entirely unconcerned with the specific events happening in its light. I was there to see it now. That seemed like a sufficient place to start from. The young physician, whose name my translator rendered as Dr. Venn, proved to be both more capable and more forthcoming than her initial anxiety suggested. After the senior physician left, she stayed in the room to monitor my transition from stasis state to full consciousness, and she answered my questions with the honest directness of someone who had decided that a patient who could ask coherent questions deserved coherent answers. I asked about the medical process. She explained it, not in the simplified version you give patients you are uncertain about, but in the full version, with the actual numbers and the actual challenges. The cellular reconstruction protocols that had been designed for Vethari physiology and had required real-time adaptation for mine. The specific biological responses my body had exhibited during the repair process that had surprised the attending physicians over the years. The monitoring thresholds that had been set, and the ones that had been revised when my biology did things the models had not predicted. You are a very unusual patient, she said, with the specific tone of a scientist describing something that continues to be interesting after extended study. I have been told, I said. There are 3 published papers on your case, she said, not using your name, but on the physiological characteristics your recovery demonstrated. They have been read extensively. She paused. The second one was cited in the Vethari Medical Academy's annual review as one of the most significant contributions to the field of cross-species trauma medicine in the decade. I am glad my situation was useful, I said, and meant it genuinely. which made her bioluminescent patterns do something surprised and quickly recomposed. I asked about the facility itself. She told me it was a civilian medical station, not a military one, that it had been expanded significantly in the past 6 years to accommodate research functions, and that the expansion had been funded through a private imperial grant rather than through standard medical budget channels. I did not ask whose grant. I asked about the monitoring systems, specifically whether the stasis pod had continuous coverage or periodic checks. She told me continuous, with redundant systems, with the alert protocol that had been set up at the specific request of the Royal Office, ensuring that any significant change would be communicated immediately. "The notification this morning," I said. "Who did it go to first?" She looked at me with the expression of someone assessing whether the question is what it appears to be, or something else. "The attending physician," she said, "and simultaneously to a private channel registered to the Royal Office." I nodded. "She arrived before I was fully conscious," I said. "Yes," Dr. Venn said. "She typically arrived before most things that she considered important were fully developed." She caught the phrasing and amended it very slightly. "I mean that she was, throughout the period of your treatment, consistently proactive in her presence here." "How long did she usually stay?" I asked. Dr. Venn was quiet for a moment, weighing something. "It varied," she said finally. "Sometimes an hour, sometimes longer. On certain occasions she stayed through the overnight monitoring shift." She paused again. "We accommodated this. The facility's protocols were adjusted to accommodate this a long time ago." I looked at the ceiling that looked like frozen starlight. "Dr. Venn," I said, "thank you for being honest with me." She seemed slightly surprised by this. Then she nodded, in the Vethari way, which is a smaller motion than the human equivalent, but carries the same weight. "You are welcome, Sergeant Hale," she said. It seemed like the appropriate approach. The first week aboard the Velsora's Mercy was the most concentrated period of learning I had experienced since the day I arrived at basic training, and basic training had not also required me to recover from 6 years of medical stasis at the same time. The ship was massive in a way that took several days to fully absorb, not just in her dimensions, which were significant by any measure, but in the way she occupied space around her. The Defiance had been a vessel you could understand completely after a week aboard, a coherent structure whose layout you could hold in your head as a single map. The Mercy was something you navigated by landmarks and by the feel of which direction the corridor was trending. Her observation deck 3 times the size of the Defiance's entire bridge. Her engine room a separate facility with its own internal transit system and its own crew rotation schedule. She was built by a civilization that had been building warships for centuries and had learned, over those centuries, that the difference between adequate and exceptional was worth the additional construction time. I was given quarters near the diplomatic section, which was practical, keeping me accessible to the briefing team without placing me in any section where my presence might complicate the ship's operational structure. The room was clean and well considered, and had a window. I confirmed on my first morning aboard that the window faced east. I said nothing about it to anyone. Eleanor Price arrived on the second day. She was a human diplomat, 44 years old, with 12 years of Galactic Council experience that showed in the way she assessed everything in her environment within the first 30 seconds of entering any space she had not previously occupied. She was direct when directness served the situation, and calibrated when it did not, and she made these adjustments so smoothly that you only noticed them if you were paying close attention. She was very good at her work, in the specific way that people become good at difficult work, when they have done it long enough to understand where the difficulty actually lives. She explained the Council's current structure across 3 sessions. 14 species with full voting seats, 7 additional species at observer status, the practical politics of how the Council actually functioned, which alliances were genuine, and which were performed for domestic audiences, which delegates said what they meant, and which said something adjacent to what they meant, and relied on the other parties to understand the difference. She covered the history of specific relationships, the ones that had been damaged by the Kethsal conflict and were in various stages of repair, and the ones that had been stable for so long that the stability had become a kind of assumption that nobody was testing because everyone was afraid of what testing might reveal. She did this the way you do it when you expect the person you are teaching to use the information, not to summarize it back to you. "You have a specific advantage in this room that I want you to understand clearly," she told me in our second session, when I had enough baseline to understand the context she was building. "The story of what happened on the Defiance is known by every species on this council. Some of them know it in more detail than most humans do, because their military analysts and their historians spent time examining it specifically. The choice that was made in that corridor translates across almost every cultural framework represented in this council." "It was not exactly a choice," I said. "There was not time for a choice." She looked at me steadily. "I know," she said. "That is the point." Sev arrived on the third day. The Vethari intelligence analyst was patient in the way of someone who understands that good intelligence requires building context before delivering conclusions. He did not give me information in bullets. He gave it in layers, each one creating the foundation for the next, so that by the time the most important pieces arrived, everything needed to receive them properly was already in place. He covered the RIM threat comprehensively, the deep sensor data, the analysis of what was being observed, and what it suggested about what was coming. He covered the specific political obstacles between the current situation and the cooperative response the situation required. He covered the individuals I would likely deal with in the council sessions, their histories, their priorities, the things they needed to be able to tell their own governments after any agreement was reached. Scholar Turning in Dawn arrived on the fifth day and immediately restructured the briefing schedule without asking anyone's permission. He was 240 years old and approximately half my height, the Relon being a species that had optimized for a different set of physical parameters than the ones that produced humans. He moved with the deliberate economy of something very old that has learned not to waste effort, and he had opinions about everything and apologized for none of them. The briefing schedule, he explained to Eleanor, with the patient clarity of someone who has had this kind of conversation many times, was organized in the way that Vethari bureaucratic tradition organized information delivery, which was not the way a human cognitive architecture absorbed information most efficiently, and he had been studying human cognitive patterns for 60 years, and was therefore better positioned than anyone currently aboard to make this assessment. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Fine," she said. "Reorganize it." He did. The resulting schedule was more effective. Eleanor did not comment on this, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Turning in Dawn told me about the study on the fourth day of our briefings. The 17-scholar analysis of human history that the Queen had commissioned years earlier. "I was one of the contributing scholars," he said. "The commission brief asked us to identify humanity's defining characteristic from the perspective of external observation. We expected to find something specific, a particular cognitive trait, a biological disposition, an evolutionary pressure that had produced something unusual." "What did you find?" I asked. "Many things, ordinary, and some things less so," he said. "And one pattern that appeared with unusual consistency across your entire recorded history, present in individuals and in groups, and in civilizations as a whole, present in advantage and in catastrophe, present when it produced good outcomes, and present when it did not." "What did you call it?" I asked. "In academic language, several things," he said, "but the phrase that was most accurate and most economical belongs to Her Majesty, not from the study. She used it before we completed the study. She told me what she expected us to find, and asked us to find where it came from." "What was the phrase?" He looked at me with the steady patience of 240 years. "The decision to try anyway," he said. I thought about Corridor 9 of the Defiance, the half-second, the body moving without asking the mind's permission. "It is not a decision," I said. "Not at the moment it happens. It is more like a direction, the way things fall when they fall." He was quiet for a moment. "That," he said, "is more precise than anything in the study. I am going to use it. Please credit me appropriately," I said. "Unlikely," he said, without any particular cruelty. "You are a sergeant. I am a scholar of 240 years. The credit will follow the credential, as it always does." I found this answer unexpectedly honest and rather liked him for it. Bright Edge appeared on the sixth day, emerging from a corridor I had not seen anyone else use, and presenting himself at my elbow in the mess hall with the quiet precision of someone who had been there longer than I had noticed. He was the Kethsol officer assigned to interspecies liaison, compact and gray-skinned, with eyes that tracked everything in any space he occupied simultaneously. His first question was about human food packaging, not the food itself, the packaging. Why it was designed the way it was, what the design decisions communicated about human priorities, whether the priorities expressed in packaging were consistent with the priorities expressed in other human behavioral patterns. I answered as honestly as I could. He took notes. Over the following days, he appeared at intervals with questions that ranged from the immediate to the philosophical. The physical training regimes humans preferred, and why. The widespread human consumption of a beverage made from processed plant seeds that elevated heart rate and simultaneously disrupted sustained concentration, while being used primarily as a tool to improve focus. The underlying structure of human humor, which he found architecturally interesting, but not yet personally accessible, in the way that humor requires personal accessibility to function. "You are a very strange species," he told me on the fourth day of these conversations, without any apparent judgment. "Most species appear strange to other species," I said. "Yes," he said. "But human strangeness is specifically excessive. Other species are strange in the direction of different. Humans are strange in the direction of more. More effort applied than the situation requires. More risk accepted than the probability calculation recommends. More persistence than the available evidence supports." "Is that a problem?" I asked. He thought about it with the genuine seriousness he brought to all questions. "At the Rim," he said, "I believe it is precisely what is needed." The Queen came to the observation deck on the evenings when her schedule allowed. She did not announce these visits. She came, stood at the viewport, and looked at the stars with the attention of someone who finds them useful for thinking. Sometimes she spoke. Sometimes we were quiet together. Both felt natural in a way I had not expected when I first woke up in that room with its frozen starlight ceiling and its east-facing window, and which I did not examine too closely, because examining it might make it self-conscious. On the seventh evening, she told me about the Kethsol elder delegate, the one from the old leadership, the one who had been there at the council when the war began, and who had survived the political transition, and was still holding his seat in the new configuration. When humanity's representative entered the council chamber for the first time after the seat was formalized, she said, he stood. He gave the warrior respect gesture. He held it for a full count, and then sat down without speaking. What did he say when he was asked about it? That he had fought humans during the war, she said, and that respecting a worthy opponent was the only response available to an honorable soldier. He also said that in 60 years on the council, he had never seen a species arrive as late as humanity had, and accumulate genuine respect as quickly. Coming from him, I said, that is not a small thing. No, she said, the old Kethsol do not offer respect as a diplomatic performance. It would not occur to them to express something they did not genuinely feel. We were quiet together, watching the stars move slowly in the viewport. I want to tell them the truth, I said, at the council session, not a prepared statement, not a diplomatic formulation, the honest version of what we are and what we are not, and why we showed up to a galaxy that did not send for us. She looked at me. That is either the most effective possible approach, she said, or a historically significant mistake. Probably both, I said. The small change happened in her expression, the very slight softening of the eyes, and the brief warmth in the bioluminescent patterns that I had been learning to recognize. Yes, she said quietly. Most important things are. I went to bed that night in the room that faced east, and did not sleep immediately. I lay in the dark and thought about the work ahead. The Rim threat was real, and would not become less real for being faced together, rather than separately. The coalition that had agreed in principle at previous sessions would need to be built into something that agreed in practice, which was a different and harder thing. 14 species, with centuries of complicated history between them, each carrying reasons not to cooperate, that were often legitimate and often genuinely ancient. I thought about Connor Price, who had made the 47 minutes possible by being the kind of officer who knew how to manage a corridor under impossible conditions. I thought about Owen Dale, running on spite and no sleep, because that was what the situation asked of him. I thought about what it meant to be here, awake, in the middle of something that mattered, with people around me who had also decided it mattered. The stars outside the east-facing window were the same stars they had always been, patient and ancient and completely unconcerned with the small, specific events occurring in their light. I closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I thought. The work was there tomorrow. The rim was there tomorrow. The council session was 6 days away, and there was still more to learn. But right now, tonight, I was simply here, awake, present. The ember had kept burning for 6 years and 4 months and 11 days, and now it was afire again. That seemed worth a moment of acknowledgement before moving forward. The evening of the 7th day, I sent a long message to Owen Dale. Not the short operational check-in I had been putting off for years, in the way you put off things that feel important, and therefore feel like they should be done properly, rather than quickly. The full message, the one that said what I had been meaning to say since before the corridor, since before the plasma wave, since back when I was carrying 2 cups of bad coffee down corridor 7, and thinking about how Owen Dale was going to need to know someday that he was the kind of Marine that other Marines would be better for having served alongside. I wrote it in one sitting, without revisions, because the right way to write something like that is to write it and send it before you can edit it into something more careful and therefore less honest. He wrote back in 11 hours. The message was short and precise in the way that good soldiers write, and at the end it said, in full, also the coffee situation is unconscionable. A man wakes up from 6 years of being nearly dead, and the first thing anyone offers him is that. Someone should answer for this. I read it twice. Then I went to find Eleanor Price and ask her whether the diplomatic calendar for the next 6 days had any flexibility, because there were things I still needed to understand about the Council's procedural norms before the session, and I wanted to use the time properly. She said the calendar had exactly the flexibility that the work required, and not more, which was her way of saying no but keep asking the right questions, and she handed me a briefing document on procedural norms that was 47 pages long, and which I read the same evening. The Mercy was a good ship to read briefing documents on. She ran quietly, the way big ships run quietly when they are built well, with the vibration of her engines present but not intrusive, a background hum that registered as competence rather than effort. The corridors were wide enough that passing someone did not require anyone to turn sideways. The mess hall had a window that showed the stars at a slightly different angle than the observation deck, and the combination of the 2 viewpoints gave you, if you paid attention to both, a reasonable sense of the ship's orientation relative to the surrounding space. I paid attention to both. I had spent the first 9 years of my career learning how to read spaces physically, how to understand a room, or a corridor, or a ship, by its layout and its rhythms and the way people move through it. This was a different kind of reading, but it used the same underlying capacity. The Mercy had been built by people who understood what a large crew needed from a shared space, and I was learning that understanding by inhabiting the space they had created. The briefing document on procedural norms was, as expected, extremely detailed on points that seemed minor, and surprisingly brief on points that seemed significant, which is the universal characteristic of all procedural documentation across every species I had encountered. I read it twice and made notes, and brought the notes to Eleanor the next morning, with 3 specific questions, that she answered, in a way that told me the questions were the right ones. You catch on quickly, she said. I have a good teacher, I said. You have 4 good teachers, she said. I am the most organized, Turning in Dawn is the most experienced, Sev is the most thorough, and Bright Edge is the most honest about what he does not know, which is a quality that is rarer than any of the others, and therefore perhaps the most valuable. I thought about this. What am I? I said. She looked at me. You are the reason they are all on this ship, she said. I did not know how to respond to that, so I did not, and she moved on to the next item in the briefing, and we got back to the work, which was what both of us were better at than talking about the work. The council station that the Relon had offered for the session was modest by galactic standards, neutral by design, a facility on a small station in space that no major power had a historical claim to, which made it, as Turning in Dawn explained with the air of someone who had chosen this venue specifically, equally inconvenient for everyone, and therefore perfectly fair. I arrived with Eleanor Price, and Sev, and Turning in Dawn, and a small human diplomatic staff that had been assembled over the previous week, People who knew the work, and knew the room, and were very good at being present, without drawing attention away from whoever needed to be the focus. We moved through the station's corridors toward the council chamber with the particular quality of a group that understands the weight of what it is about to do, and is not pretending otherwise. The chamber itself was mid-sized, built in the style that Galactic Council facilities favored, circular, with all parties arranged on the same level, no position of elevation or subordination built into the architecture. The lighting was calibrated to be acceptable across several different species' visual ranges. The air composition was adjusted similarly. The session administrator, an ancient being from a species I could not identify whose role in the proceedings was purely logistical, was managing these adjustments with the focused precision of someone who has been doing this work long enough to care deeply about getting the small things right. 14 delegations were seated when we entered. I had been given brief portraits of each delegation's primary representative during the previous week, portraits that went beyond official biography into the more useful information about what each person needed, what they feared, what they had been told to achieve, and what they actually hoped for. This kind of information is what separates effective diplomatic preparation from adequate diplomatic preparation, and Eleanor and Sev had provided it thoroughly. The Kethsol delegation was seated directly across the chamber from the entrance. The elder delegate, the one from the old leadership, was central. He was very old in the particular way that beings become old when they have survived long enough to watch everything they knew change around them. He moved deliberately and unhurried, with the economy of motion that extreme experience produces. His eyes, built for frequencies I could not access, tracked everything in the room simultaneously. I knew about him from the briefings. I knew about his 60 years of council service, his position during the Kethsol War, his survival of the political transition that followed the war's end. I knew about the warrior respect gesture he had given when humanity's representative entered the council chamber for the first time. I knew that he did not do things for performance, and that what he did was therefore reliable information about what he actually thought. The session administrator called the session to order. The formal proceedings, announcements and agenda confirmations, and the careful procedural work that gives the substantive work a proper foundation. I was introduced as humanity's special envoy. Brief, factual, accurate. The Kethsol elder stood. He moved with deliberate care, rising to his full height, and he gave the warrior respect gesture, steady and complete, not abbreviated. He held it for the count, and then sat down without speaking. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then the session administrator continued, and the work of the day began. I spoke when I was called on, and listened carefully when I was not. I asked Eleanor twice for clarification on procedural points that I did not have enough context to navigate alone, and she provided it efficiently and without drawing attention to the fact that I needed it. Sev passed me a note at one point that contained a single sentence of context about a reference one of the Vethari delegates had made to a historical agreement, context that changed the meaning of what the delegate was saying significantly. I absorbed it and adjusted what I had been planning to say, and Sev's expression when I did this told me the adjustment was the right one. The session ran for 4.5 hours. At one point, the administrator invited each delegation to speak to the proposed framework for the coordinated response to the Rim threat. It was my turn among the others. Nothing elevated, simply my position in the sequence. I stood up. I did not pitch my voice for authority or gravitas. I spoke the way you speak, when you want to genuinely reach the people you are talking to, not impress them or perform for them, but actually reach them in the way that produces something real. I have been asleep for 6 years, I said. I was not present for most of what this council has been through since the Kethsol conflict began. I am not going to pretend I understand your histories as well as you do, because I do not, and pretending otherwise would be both dishonest and pointless, and you would know it immediately. The room was quiet and paying attention. What I can speak to is something I know from direct experience rather than briefing files, I said. The question of what it takes to face something larger than yourself when the outcome is not guaranteed. Not the theory. The specific experience of being the person in the corridor when the calculation says the outcome has been decided, and the only remaining variable is whether you accept that. I looked around the room. 14 delegations. Centuries of history between them, much of it complicated, some of it still unhealed. You do not defeat something ancient and overwhelming by being the strongest presence in the room, I said. You defeat it by being the last one still functioning. Not because you are unbeatable, because you refuse to stop functioning when the situation suggests very strongly that you should. I paused and let that land. Humanity is new to this table, I said. We do not carry your centuries of agreements and obligations and historical debts to each other. We arrived after the major frameworks were already established. You did not need us, and you did not ask for us. We showed up anyway. I let that sit for a moment. That is what we do, and we do not stop. That is not strategy. It is simply what we are. You have seen evidence of it. I am suggesting that evidence is relevant to the situation currently in front of this council. I sat down. Eleanor, to my right, did not look at me, but I saw her exhale slowly, the quiet release of someone who has been holding something and can now let it go. The session continued for another 2 hours after that. I spoke when the conversation specifically required a human perspective, and listened carefully when it did not. By the end of the session, the basic framework of a coordinated response to the RIM threat had been agreed in principle. 14 species with centuries of complicated, often difficult history between them, sitting in the same room for the third time in 8 months, had agreed in principle to build something together. Nothing was resolved. Everything had been begun. In the work of building cooperation between parties who have legitimate reasons not to cooperate, the beginning is the hardest step, and it had been taken. Bright Edge found me in the corridor outside the session room before I reached the transport area. "The phrase you used," he said, appearing at my side with his characteristic quiet precision. "Not the strongest in the room. The last one still functioning." "Yes," I said. "The Keth soul have a concept for this quality," he said. "The deep fighter, the one who does not win through superior strength, but through the refusal to stop. We consider it the highest military quality we recognize, because strength is a physical fact, but the deep fighter is a decision made under conditions that recommend the opposite decision." "Did you find it in humans?" I asked. He looked at me with the steady calm of someone who has reviewed evidence carefully and has arrived at a conclusion he is confident in. "Yes," he said. "Not in every individual, not in every situation, but as a cultural orientation, as a civilizational tendency, yes, we found it clearly." "Your elders thought we were primitive," I said, "when we first arrived." "Yes," he said. "We assessed the technology available to you and the length of your spacefaring history, and made conclusions based on those variables." He paused. "We were not assessing for the variable that turned out to be the relevant one." He left it there. He was a careful person with words, Bright Edge. He said what needed to be said and not more. I walked back toward the transport section with Eleanor and Sev and Turning in Dawn, through the neutral corridors of a station that belonged to no one specifically, and therefore served everyone adequately, thinking about what it means to be found. Not recognized for something you performed or displayed deliberately, but found for something you simply are. Something that runs through your history, the way geology runs through landscape, shaping everything without announcing itself. Eleanor said, as we reached the transport bay, "That went better than the previous 2 sessions." "How much better?" I asked. "Both previous sessions ended before agreement," she said. "Today the agreement exists." "In principle," I said. "In principle is where everything starts," she said. "Nothing begins in practice. Practice is what happens to things that exist in principle and survive contact with reality." Turning in Dawn said, from slightly behind us, "That is the most accurate thing Eleanor has said in my presence in 3 years of working with her." Eleanor did not respond to this, which was its own kind of response. The transport back to the Mercy was quiet. Sev reviewed his notes. Eleanor organized materials for the follow-up communications that would need to go out to each delegation within 48 hours. Turning in Dawn sat with his eyes closed, either resting or thinking or both, in the way of someone very old who had learned not to waste any available state. I looked out the viewport at the stars between the station and the ship and thought about what had just happened and what it meant. 14 species, centuries of complicated history, a threat at the rim that none of them could face alone, and all of them had been finding reasons not to face together. And today, in a neutral chamber, built to put everyone on the same level, they had agreed in principle to try. The decision to try anyway. Not just a human quality, I was understanding. Present across the species in this room. Present in the Kethsol elder who had stood and given the warrior respect gesture to a species his leadership had tried to eliminate 3 years earlier, present in the Relon scholars who had spent 3 years trying to understand something that mattered to them, present in every delegation that had shown up to this session, knowing the previous 2 had ended without agreement. But in humans, foundational, consistent, appearing without needing a specific exceptional circumstance to bring it out. The ship grew in the viewport as we approached. Silver blue hull, ancient light caught, and given back as something both mirror and ocean. The largest warship I had ever been close to, built by a civilization that had been building warships for centuries, and had learned in those centuries what mattered and what did not. I was going to help them face whatever was at the rim. I did not know how that would go. I did not know all the ways it would be harder than it looked from here, and I knew from experience that it would be harder than it looked from here, because everything was, but I was here, and I was functional, and the ember had kept burning, and now I was going to use it for something worth the burning. That felt like the right use. Scholar Turning and Dawn found me in the corridor outside the session room approximately 12 minutes after Bright Edge had left, emerging from a side passage with the deliberate pace of someone who has been in many corridors over 240 years and has never seen the need to rush through any of them. "The elder delegate met with you privately," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "I am aware of what was discussed," he said. He communicated the substance to me afterward. The Kethsol have a long tradition of informing their Relon counterparts of significant diplomatic developments, from the period before the territorial disputes made that tradition complicated, and he has revived it as a personal practice. He paused. "I wanted to be the one to tell you that." "Why?" I asked. "Because you will need to know which channels of communication exist," he said. "The formal ones are documented. The informal ones are known only through experience, and the most important ones are often the informal ones." He looked at me with the steady patience of very old wisdom. "The elder delegate communicates with me. I communicate with the Queen. This is how certain information flows quickly when it needs to flow quickly. I considered this." "What did you tell her?" I asked. "That the session had produced what she anticipated," he said, "and that you had handled the private meeting in the way she had said you would." "She predicted what would happen in that room," I said. "She predicted what you would do in that room," he said. "The elder delegate's response to it, she left as uncertain. But your behavior, she considered knowable in advance." He paused. "She was correct." I thought about this for a moment, about what it meant to be that well understood by someone who had known you for a total of perhaps 20 conscious hours across a 6-year period, about what you have to pay attention to, and how carefully, to understand something you have so little direct information about. "She watched me carry coffee down a corridor," I said. "She watched you carry coffee down a corridor," he said. "She watched you stand in corridors and look reliable. She watched you run toward the diplomatic section when the ship came under attack. She saw the result of the corridor." He paused. "And then she had 6 years to think about what all of that information meant. 6 years is a significant amount of thinking time." "Yes," I said. "I suppose it is." He walked beside me for a moment, in the companionable way of someone who has something else to say, and is measuring the right moment for it. "She did not tell me she was learning English," he said. "I found out through other means. I asked her about it." "What did she say?" I said. "She said it was practical," he said. "She used that word, practical." He paused. "In my experience of her, when she describes something as practical, it is the thing she considers most important, but is unwilling to assign emotional weight to directly. The practical thing is always the thing that matters." I thought about the east-facing window, the room rotation, the monitoring channel, all of them practical, all of them things she had done without knowing the outcome, and without describing them as anything other than reasonable responses to available information. "I understand," I said. "I thought you might," he said, and he turned into a side corridor and was gone, with the particular efficiency of someone who has said what he came to say, and has no interest in saying more than that. I went back to the transport and sat beside the viewport for the rest of the journey, watching the station recede and the Mercy grow, and thinking about practical things, and what they meant, and what the work ahead was going to require, and what I was going to give to it, and whether the giving would be enough. I did not resolve these questions on the transport. I did not resolve them that evening, or the next morning, or the week after that. but I kept carrying them forward, which is perhaps the same thing. The thing about the council session that I had not fully anticipated before it happened was the texture of the room itself, not its physical dimensions, which were what the briefing documents described, or its technological systems, which were what Sev had prepared me for. The texture, which is the quality that no briefing document captures because it is made of the accumulation of all the specific things happening at once. The way 14 different kinds of attention feel when they are all directed at the same point. The specific quality of a silence between parties who do not trust each other's silences. The particular energy of a room in which everyone is measuring what they say against what it will mean to 12 other parties who are all measuring at the same time. This is a different kind of high-stakes environment than a burning corridor. In the corridor, everything is immediate and physical, and the decisions happen in fractions of seconds. In the council chamber, everything is slow and deliberate, and the decisions happen in layers, each layer needing to account for the layers below it before it can exist. I found I was more comfortable in it than I had expected to be. Not because I was better at it than the trained diplomats in the room. Eleanor and Sev were both better at the specific technical work of diplomatic exchange than I was, and would remain better at it for a long time regardless of how much I learned. But I was comfortable in the room in a way that did not come from skill. It came from not being afraid of it. I had stood in burning corridors. I had absorbed things unsurvivable. I had slept for 6 years and woken up into a galaxy that had moved without me, and had not found that to be disqualifying. A council chamber with 14 delegations was difficult. It was not that. That absence of fear, in a room where everyone was measuring for signs of weakness, was legible. It was not something I performed. It was simply the state I was in, and it communicated on its own. The Kethsol elder had seen it immediately. That much was clear from the meeting in the observation room. He had been reading the room the way someone reads a room who has been doing it for 60 years, and what he had read in me had been consistent with what he needed to read before he would extend what he extended. That made the subsequent partnership offer possible, and the partnership offer made the coalition structure fundamentally different from what it had been when we entered the session that morning. One absence of fear, one consistent alignment between who I was and what the room needed to receive. A chain of consequences that produced something real. That is how most things actually happen, not through heroism or strategy, through showing up as what you are, at the moment when what you are is the needed thing. The follow-up work after the session was the kind of work that looks invisible from the outside, but is actually where agreements live or die. Eleanor ran most of it. She had 12 years of experience in exactly this type of situation, the period immediately after a principle has been agreed, and before it has been tested against the specific points where the parties involved have fundamentally different interests. She moved through it with the efficient focus of a person who understands that this window is narrow and that every hour inside it matters. I helped where my specific presence was useful and stepped back where it was not. The sessions with the Kethsol delegation's secondary team, 3 younger officers who had been brought as technical advisors, were mine. They were the ones who had grown up with the story of the Defiance as a piece of military education rather than a piece of history they had lived through, and they approached me with the specific kind of careful attention you give to something you have studied rather than something you have encountered. I answered their questions directly about the fight and about what the Defiance had been trying to accomplish and about what humanity understood itself to be doing in the galactic community it had arrived late to. They listened with the focused seriousness of people being given primary source information on something important. The second session with the combined Vethari and Relon delegations went to Sev, who knew both groups better than I did, and navigated the specific friction points between them with the patient expertise of someone who had been working those relationships for years. I sat in and listened and contributed twice, with observations that Eleanor had coached me were the right moments to speak, and they were indeed the right moments, which told me her judgment was very good, and told me to keep listening to it. Turning in Dawn ran the session with the smaller species delegations himself, without consulting anyone about this decision in advance, and it went by Eleanor's assessment afterward exceptionally well, partly because the smaller delegations had been feeling marginal to the main discussions, and partly because Turning in Dawn was 240 years old, and had been a peripheral party at galactic negotiations before, and knew exactly what it felt like, and what it took to feel included, without being falsely elevated. On the third day after the main session, I had a conversation with the Kethsol elder, that I had not planned, and that turned out to be among the most significant of the entire process. He requested it directly, through the session administrator, in the formal Kethsol method, for requesting a private meeting with a non-Kethsol party. A written message delivered in person by a junior delegate, specifying the time and location he preferred. A small observation room off the main corridor, mid-morning, only translators present. I went. He was already there when I arrived. He had brought no junior delegates, only a translation unit, placed on the table between us without preamble, and he sat across from me with the unhurried patience of someone who has been through enough of these conversations to know that beginning well matters more than beginning quickly. "I am told," he said through the translator, "that you do not remember the moment in the corridor, that it happened faster than memory can record." "That is accurate," I said. "I was in the war room," he said, "when the report of the Defiance's engagement reached us. I was part of the leadership at that time. I read the timeline. 47 minutes. He paused. "I have spent 3 years thinking about what that number means." I waited. "In Kethsol military doctrine," he said, "there is a quality we identify in certain soldiers. We call it the deep fight. The willingness to continue engaging past the point where the probability of success has fallen below any level that rational calculation supports. We have always treated this as an individual trait. Exceptional. Rare." He looked at me steadily. The Defiance's engagement timeline suggested it was not individual in humans. It suggested it was systemic. "A culture produces what it values," I said. "Yes," he said. "And what a culture values can be seen most clearly in what it does, when no one is evaluating the outcome, when the odds are certain, and the result is not in doubt. What a species does in those moments is the clearest available information about what that species actually is." He was quiet for a moment. "I voted against the attack," he said. "I was not yet in the leadership position that would have made the vote determinative, but I voted against it. I believed it was a mistake. I believed that a species capable of reaching this part of space on their own was not going to be stopped by eliminating one diplomatic convoy, and that the attempt would tell that species something about us that would make the eventual confrontation more difficult." "You were right," I said. "I was right about the outcome," he said. "I was not entirely right about the reasoning. I expected humanity to be angered. I did not anticipate that they would also be instructive." He looked at me across the translator unit. "You taught us what we were dealing with by doing it, not by saying it. No diplomatic statement could have communicated what 47 minutes communicated to every species that received the report." I thought about Louise Hargrove's voice on the shipwide channel, flat and precise. The crew of the Defiance doing their jobs and continuing to do them past every point where doing them became harder. "They were doing their jobs," I said. "Yes," he said. "That is the point." We sat in the small observation room for a while longer. He asked about the coalition's structure and the specific pressure points I anticipated in the work ahead. I answered honestly, including the places where I was uncertain, because he was the kind of person who would identify false confidence immediately and find honest uncertainty far more credible. He asked what humanity planned to contribute to the coordinated response at the Rim. I told him what I knew, which was a preliminary commitment that was real but not yet fully defined, and that the defining was part of what I was here to do. "We will contribute alongside you," he said. "The Kethsol, not as allied support to the Vethari contingent, directly alongside the human contingent." I looked at him. "The Kethsol fought against humanity 3 years ago," I said. "Yes," he said. "And the outcome of that fight has given us information that makes the correct position in this situation clear." He paused. "There is a Kethsol concept for a partnership formed between former opponents who have each demonstrated sufficient quality in the opposition. It is one of our oldest honorifics. It has not been extended to a non-Kethsol species in my lifetime." "What does it translate to, roughly?" I said. "Worthy to stand beside," he said. I sat with that for a moment. "We will be glad to stand beside you," I said. He nodded once. "Precisely." We left the observation room separately, as the meeting's format required, and I walked back through the station's corridors thinking about the weight of what had just happened. Bright Edge was waiting near the transport bay, which no longer surprised me. "The elder delegate," Bright Edge said, not as a question. "Yes," I said. He told me he was going to request the meeting, Bright Edge said. He wanted my assessment of whether you would receive the conversation correctly. What did you tell him? That you would, Bright Edge said. That humans generally do not receive things they are not prepared to receive, but that when they are prepared, they receive them completely. Is that a compliment? I asked. It is an accurate observation, he said. In this context, also a compliment. Eleanor, when I briefed her, was quiet for a moment before she spoke. The Kethsol committing to a direct partnership, she said carefully. Not through the Vethari alliance structure, directly alongside the human contingent. Correct, I said. Do you understand what that means for the framework? She said. Tell me, I said. It means the coalition has a center, she said, a stable structure that the other parties can organize around, rather than a collection of parties each trying to join something that does not yet have a foundation. The previous 2 session failures both happened because there was no center. Now there is one. She paused. How did you do that? I did not do it, I said. He did it. I showed up and received it properly. She looked at me with the expression she had sometimes, the one that was doing careful recalculation about something she had thought she understood. That, she said, is also how it works. The return trip to the Mercy was quiet, in a different way than the first one had been. The first trip had been the quiet of people absorbing what had been accomplished. This one was the quiet of people understanding that the structure of what they were building had shifted significantly and needing a moment before moving forward with the changed weight. Turning and Dawn sat with his eyes open this time, watching the stars outside the viewport. She was right, he said, to no one in particular. About what? I asked. About what you would do here, he said. I did not entirely believe her assessment when she first made it. I thought it was personal, feeling overweighting the available evidence. I was wrong. He paused. She has, in my experience, not been wrong about something important in the time I have known her, but I was still not fully prepared to believe this particular assessment until I observed the evidence myself. What was the assessment? I asked. He looked at me with the steady calm of 240 years. That a human who had survived what you survived, who had been kept alive by a civilization that had no particular obligation to expend those resources, who had woken into a world that had moved 6 years forward without him, would not spend that situation on himself, he said. That he would spend it on the work. I looked out at the stars. She said that? I said. Not in those exact words, he said. In different words that meant the same thing. I thought about the room facing east. The language learned across 6 years, in whatever spare hours were available. 300 star systems and the weight of a crown, and still, in the evenings, a person who came to the observation deck because the stars did not require anything of you. She was right, I said. She usually is, he said. It is one of her most significant qualities, and also, for everyone around her, one of the more exhausting ones. I almost laughed. Outside the viewport, the Mercy grew slowly larger as the transport approached her, the silver blue of her hull picking up the light of the nearest star and giving it back changed, the way mirrors change what they show, without being dishonest about it. The ship that had been named for mercy and built for strength, carrying forward the people who were doing the work of keeping something from becoming a catastrophe. I thought about Connor Price, about the Defiance fighting for 47 minutes to give the people inside time, about the specific kind of dedication that looks like ordinary professional behavior from the outside, and is, from the inside, the most fundamental thing you have. The work was not finished. The work would not be finished for a long time. The Rim threat was real, and the coalition that had been built today in principle would have to be built in practice through months of harder, slower, less dramatic negotiation than the sessions we had just completed. There would be setbacks. There would be parties who agreed in principle and then found specific points in the practice where they could not follow through. There would be moments where the whole thing looked more fragile than it had looked today. But it existed. Today it had not existed, and now it did, and that was the work's most fundamental product, the thing that could not be undone once it had been made. I pressed my hand against the viewport and watched the Mercy fill the frame as we closed the distance. The ember had kept burning. Now I was going to find out what it could light. That evening, I sat in the room facing east and wrote out everything I could remember from the elder delegates' private conversation. Not for the diplomatic record, but for myself. The way you write things down when you want to understand them better than you understood them while they were happening. He had said, "What a culture values can be seen in what it does when no one is evaluating the outcome." I had been thinking about that phrase since the observation room. The Defiance had fought for 47 minutes. Nobody evaluated that outcome in the moment. There was no audience deciding whether 47 minutes was the correct amount to fight before stopping. No committee weighing the resource expenditure against the diplomatic value. No calculation of whether the crew would have been better served stopping at 40 or 50. The crew had simply kept doing what they were there to do until they could not anymore. That was the thing that communicated, not the decision to fight, the decision to keep fighting once the outcome was clear. The sustained application of effort past the point of any conceivable optimism. In the corridor, I had had even less time to choose than that. Half a second. Maybe less. Not enough time to evaluate. Only enough time for the body to find its direction. The elder delegate had spent 3 years thinking about the number 47. I had spent 6 years not thinking about anything, and we had arrived in the same small observation room on the same neutral station, and found, between the translator unit and the careful silence, that we were talking about the same thing from different angles. That is also how things happen. People carry something for years, separately, in different contexts, and then sit across a table and find they have been carrying the same weight. I finished my notes and read them over. Then I sent a brief message to Eleanor, flagging 2 points from the elder delegate's conversation that I thought had implications for the technical coordination discussions she was managing. Points that were not operational in themselves, but that told her something about the Kethsol's underlying priorities that would help her navigate the detail work. She wrote back in an hour with a single line. "Yes, both of those. Thank you." That was Eleanor's version of extensive praise. I went to sleep in the room facing east. In the morning there was more work, as there was always more work. But the work had a different quality than it had had the previous week. It had the quality of work that is building on a foundation rather than looking for one. The difference between laying the first course of stones and continuing to build something that is already standing. Sev scheduled a full briefing on the next phase of coordination needs. The 14 delegations had agreed in principle, but principle required practice, and practice required information, and information in this kind of coalition required trust, and trust between species with complex histories required time and consistency and the accumulated evidence of behavior that matched stated intentions. I was going to be part of that evidence accumulation, showing up, being consistent, being what I said I was, in settings where the evaluation happened whether you were aware of it or not. This was not a burden. It was a description of what I had been doing my whole career. Being reliable in conditions where reliability was neither easy nor guaranteed, but was the only thing that made the larger structure possible. I had been a sergeant. Sergeants are the reliability that infantry units are built on, not the strategy, not the command, not the vision, but the steady, reliable presence that makes everything else possible because it is consistently there. Now the scale was larger, and the unit was a coalition of 14 species, and the mission was something old and dangerous, at the rim of the known galaxy. But the fundamental requirement was the same. Show up, be what you said you were, keep going. I could do that. I had been doing that for 15 years. I put on my jacket and went to the morning briefing. Bright Edge was already there, which no longer surprised me. Turning and Dawn arrived 3 minutes after I did, which also no longer surprised me, since Turning and Dawn operated on his own schedule, that bore no relation to the official schedule, but somehow resulted in his being present for everything important. Sev presented the next phase plan. It was thorough and practical, and had been built on the foundation of what the session had produced. Eleanor asked 3 precise questions that changed 2 elements of the plan and improved both of them. I contributed twice with observations from the elder delegates' conversation that were relevant to the Kethsol engagement timeline, which Sev incorporated immediately. The meeting ran 90 minutes. The meeting produced useful outputs. The morning light came through the viewport of the briefing room at a low angle, the same way morning light came through every east-facing window at this time of day, consistent and patient and reliably there. The ember had become a fire. The fire had work to do. 3 months after the council session, I was standing on the observation deck of the Mercy, watching stars I still did not know the names of scroll, slowly past the viewport, and I was thinking about what it means to carry something forward. The Coalition had survived its first real test. The test came 6 weeks after the session, when the Relon survey vessel operating at the rim's edge sent back data that confirmed the threat was larger and more active than the preliminary readings had suggested. The data was shared with all 14 delegations simultaneously, which had been agreed as a protocol during the session, and the response to the data told more about the Coalition's health than the session itself had. 7 delegations had someone on a communication line within hours, asking questions, sharing analysis, indicating their current status, and their readiness to commit specific resources. 4 delegations took 2 days to respond, which was within acceptable parameters for species whose bureaucratic structures moved at institutional pace. The remaining 3 took longer, and the reasons varied, and Eleanor worked each of those relationships individually, with the patience of someone who understands that the work of building trust is not finished when the principle is agreed, but continues through every subsequent interaction. The Keth Sol responded first, before any of the others. The elder delegate himself sent the initial communication, directed to my channel specifically, with a straightforward statement of Keth Sol capabilities, current positioning, and readiness timeline. At the bottom of the message, below the operational details, he had written in Keth Sol, "The worthy do not wait to be asked." Bright Edge translated it for me with the particular satisfaction of someone who anticipated that I would understand the full weight of it. I understood. We were still weeks from anything that could be called an operational deployment. The coordination between 14 species militaries, even in principle, involved systems and protocols and communication standards that had never been designed to work together, and were being adapted on the fly by people who were very good at their jobs and very aware that the margins were narrow. Eleanor called it, in a private moment that I think she would have expressed differently in a formal report, the most complicated logistics problem she had ever been asked to help solve. I called it Tuesday, which she did not find as reassuring as I intended it. The Queen came to the observation deck in the evenings when her schedule allowed, as she had throughout the process. On the evening I am thinking about, she had been in session with the Vethari Military Command for 6 hours, reviewing deployment plans and resource allocations, and the silver of her bioluminescent patterns was very still in the way that indicated sustained concentration rather than rest. She moved to stand beside me at the viewport. We were quiet for a while. Not the quiet of people who have nothing to say to each other, but the quiet of people who have said a great deal to each other over a significant period of time, and no longer need to fill space with words in order to be present together. Turning in Dawn told me something, I said eventually. He tells many things, she said. He has had 240 years to accumulate them. He told me what you said, I said, about what you thought I would do with the situation I woke up into. She was quiet for a moment. He was not supposed to do that, she said. I know, I said. He told me that too. He told me approximately simultaneously. He is a very specific kind of person. Yes, she said. He is. We were quiet again. Were you right? I said. She looked at me. The stillness of her patterns shifted very slightly. Yes, she said. But it was not a difficult prediction to make. The quality was visible before you were awake to demonstrate it. In the corridor, I said. In everything, she said. The corridor was simply the most visible instance. It was also in how the Defiance fought. It was in the structure of human history that the scholars spent 3 years examining. It was in the crew that held their formation in burning corridors. She paused. A species does not produce one instance of something and then have no more of it. The instance is evidence of the underlying pattern. I thought about this, about being evidence, about the particular position of being the thing that a civilization sent forward, not because you were the best possible example of what they were, but because you were a genuine one. The Defiance is being rebuilt, I said. Earth Command confirmed it 2 days ago. She looked at me. Same name? She said. Same name, I said. New ship, full commission. They want her out here. Yes, she said. They do. I had written the recommendation in my log entry, the night after the first council session. I had not known at the time whether it would be acted on or filed. Earth Command had its own considerations and its own prioritization process, and a sergeant's recommendation, Even a sergeant who had apparently become diplomatically useful was not automatically determinative. But the name mattered. Eleanor had confirmed this. Sev had confirmed it. Even Turning in Dawn, in his own way, had confirmed it when he told me that the scholars studying galactic diplomatic history had identified the Defiance as what he called a crystallization point, a moment around which subsequent events organized because it had defined something clearly enough that nothing after it could pretend the definition did not exist. The Defiance had defined something. Her crew had defined it by doing their jobs past the point where stopping would have been entirely reasonable. She had defined it by burning for 47 minutes against 30 destroyers while the people inside her got clear. Her name deserved to keep going. "I want to ask you something," I said. "Yes," she said. "The study," I said. "The 17 scholars. You told them the quality you wanted them to confirm. You already knew what you were looking for." "Yes," she said. "How did you know?" She was quiet for a moment. The stars moved slowly in the viewport. "I was in the corridor," she said. "I had been trained since childhood in crisis response. I had a protocol. I had practice. I had everything I had been given to manage exactly this type of situation." She paused, and I stopped. Because the protocol requires stopping. Because the assessment requires a moment. Because the precision requires the pause. She was looking at the stars, not at me, but her patterns moved through something warm. And in the time I was pausing, someone behind me made a decision that was not a decision, that was simply a direction. And I understood in that moment that this was not something I had been trained for, or could have been trained for. It was something that was simply there. I said nothing. "I wanted to know if it was you specifically," she said, "or if it was what you are." "Both," I said. "Yes," she said. "Both. But the second one is what matters for the work we are doing. The first one is personal." I looked at her. She was still looking at the stars. I did not push the edge of that comment. I filed it with the other things I had been filing. The room facing east, the language learned without knowing if it would be heard, the visits to the station that the logs showed across 6 years of uncertainty. I filed it in the place where I kept things that were true, but that deserved to be held carefully rather than rushed. "The Kethsol Elder asked me something," I said. "In the observation room. He asked what humanity planned to contribute at the Rim. What did you tell him?" "The truth," I said. "That the commitment was real, and not yet fully defined, and that defining it was part of what I was here to do." "And he extended the partnership offer after that?" "Free," she said. "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "He tested you," she said. "Not aggressively, but he wanted to know if you would be honest about uncertainty, or if you would perform confidence to protect an image. The answer you gave told him what he needed to know." "He told me it was about being worthy to stand beside," I said. "Yes," she said. "For the Kethsol, that is not a diplomatic phrase. It is a specific designation, with specific implications. He did not use it lightly." "I know," I said. We stood in the quiet and watched the stars. After a while I said, "When this is over, when the Rim situation is resolved, or as resolved as these things get, what happens?" She considered the question with the same serious attention she brought to everything. "The coalition will have produced a precedent," she said. 14 species cooperating on a genuine threat. That precedent will outlast the specific threat. It changes the structure of what is possible." She paused. "And humanity will have been part of building that structure, not as a peripheral contributor, but as a centerpiece." "That is the diplomatic answer," I said. She turned to look at me. "What is the other answer?" she said. "I do not know," I said honestly. "I have been trying to figure out what the next part looks like. After the mission has a shape I can see clearly." She looked at me for a long moment. Her bioluminescent patterns moved through something very slow and very deliberate. "There is always more work," she said finally. "There is no version of this in which the work runs out." "That is either a reassurance or a warning," I said. "Both," she said, "but mostly a reassurance." She paused. "And there are other things that do not run out either." I looked at her. She looked back at me with her steady dark eyes, the eyes that had no whites, built for a spectrum broader than mine, that had looked through me in a corridor on a ship that no longer existed, and had subsequently looked at me across 6 years of uncertain dark, and had been the first thing she angled toward when the pod opened, and the world began again. I thought about what Turning in Dawn had said, what she had said, through him, that a human who woke up into this situation would not spend it on himself, that he would spend it on the work. I thought about the fact that the work and the not spending it on himself were not as separate as that framing suggested, that the work was the thing that made the not spending it on himself possible, because the work was what gave the waking up a direction, and the direction was what made the waking up worth doing. And I thought about the room facing east, and the language learned in empty rooms, and the monitoring channel that had been set up at specific request, so that the notification would arrive the moment the pod showed a change. All of that was also work, just a different kind. I sent a log entry to Earth Command, I said, after the first session. I know, she said. The diplomatic office is copied. I recommended rebuilding the Defiance, I said. I know, she said. I endorsed it before the message arrived. I looked at her. How did you know I would say that? I said. The corner of her mouth moved.
That very small change.
Because you are the kind of person, she said, who, after waking up from 6 years of stasis and absorbing 6 years of history in 8 days, and standing in front of 14 species, and helping build a coalition that 2 previous attempts had failed to build, would sit down at the end of the day and think about the ship. I considered this. You know me very well, I said. For someone who looked through me like furniture for the first 2 days we were on the same ship. The very small change in her expression became slightly less small. I was observing, she said. I was not dismissing. There is a difference? I said. A very significant one, she said. We stood together at the viewport while the stars turned in their patient ancient arcs, and the ship moved forward through the dark between them, carrying forward the work that we had started, and the work that was still ahead, and the people who had decided the work was worth doing. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the viewport. Below us, somewhere in the vast dark of the rim, something old was active and would have to be addressed. Above us, the stars were the stars they had always been. Inside the ship, the coalition that had been built in principle was being built in practice. One communication, and one coordination session, and one carefully maintained relationship at a time. Connor Price was not here. The original Defiance was gone. Some things that should have survived had not. But I was here. The ember had kept burning, and the new Defiance was being built. Same name, ready to put the name back into space where it still meant something. I thought about Owen Dale. I had finally sent him a proper message 2 weeks after waking up. The message I had been putting off since I could remember putting things off. The one that said clearly what I thought of him, and what working alongside him had meant. He had written back within 12 hours. A short message in the way that good soldiers write, direct and genuine, and at the end absolutely unreasonably funny about the coffee. He was fine. He was very good. He was doing the work. That was enough. That was what you wanted for the people you had been in the corridors with, that they were doing the work, and they were fine. I stepped back from the viewport. She was still standing beside it, looking at the stars with the attention she always gave them. The coffee on this ship, I said. She turned to look at me. Yes, she said. It is better than the Defiance, I said. All coffee is better than the Defiance's coffee, she said. That was a structural failing of the provisioning contract. It is still not good, I said. No, she said. It is not. I have conveyed your concerns to the supply officers. 3 times, I said. 3 times, she confirmed. They are aware of your position. And they have explained, she said, very carefully, that the available supply chains in this region of space have not historically been optimized for human beverage preferences. This is, I said, the most diplomatic way anyone has ever told me that I should manage my expectations. You are working with a diplomat, she said. I almost laughed. Actually almost. Close enough that she noticed and her patterns shifted through something warm. Tomorrow, I said. The coordination session with the Keth Sol and the Relanon technical teams. At 8 in the morning, she said, you have the briefing materials. I have read them, I said, twice. Then you are prepared, she said. I am also going to get there early, I said. with coffee. For everyone. Whatever quality is available. She looked at me. That, she said, is one of the most human things you have said in my presence. Is that a criticism? I asked. No, she said. It is an observation. And a compliment. I nodded once. She nodded once. We stood in the quiet of the observation deck for a little while longer, the two of us, and the stars, and the vast dark between them, and the work ahead that was real, and hard, and worth doing. Then she said goodnight and went to work, because there was always more work, and I went to my quarters and slept in the room facing east and did not dream, because I did not need to, because the thing I had been moving toward for 6 years and 4 months and 11 days was no longer ahead of me in the dark but here, present, in the actual day that I was living in. In the morning I got up early. I got to the coordination room before anyone else. I brought the coffee. It was not good coffee. It had never been good coffee. I had serious doubts it would improve. But it was hot, and it was there, and when the Kethsol technical officer arrived and looked at the cup I handed her with an expression of scientific curiosity, I found that I was genuinely glad to be the person in the room holding it. Some things do not change. Some things you carry forward because they are what you are, not what you have decided to be, and carrying them is how you know you are still moving in the right direction. I sat down at the table in the coordination room on the ship named for Mercy, with the coffee that was not good but was hot, and I waited for the work to begin. It always began. That was the thing about the work. It always began, and so did you, and that was what the decision to try anyway actually looked like from the inside. Not a moment of heroism, not a flash of clarity, just a person, at a table, with a cup of imperfect coffee, ready for whatever the day brought. The door opened. They came in. We got to work.